Welcome to the Knowledge Series Session 3 with Earth. Thank you so much for taking your time out. I just thought we will just quickly start with certain interesting facts and insights around IWBI. So let me start by mentioning IWBI's mission to put edge health and humanity in ESG. So we have seen leading brands feature well in ESG reporting. They also use well to track and report human and social capital performance across portfolios and organizations. So we do see that happening. While major brands might already report on the ESG strategies, we continue to see a clear opportunity to showcase health and well-being as a major component to an organization's growth, which is a fundamental component of ESG. So in that regards, how do you envision the intersection of wellness and ESG landscape impacting individuals and businesses, more so in a country like India, which is so beautifully diverse, and businesses also have a lot of local than only global, and hence the sweet spot there is like local. So how do you see that?
Yeah, it's a great opening question. Thanks, Shuchita. And I was fortunate enough to visit India in July last year for the very first time, and I completely appreciate the diversity of the country when it comes to business. We traveled to Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Mumbai, and I could pick up on that quite significantly. But it was one of my favorite countries that I have ever visited. I had such a good time. I'm originally from South Africa, a place called Durban, which has a very big Indian community. And so since I was a little boy, I've been wanting to get to India, and it didn't disappoint. I'm also very excited that I'm going to be in India in 2 weeks in Bangalore and Mumbai for the World Summit. So looking forward to coming back to that. It's a great question around ESG. And I think before I get into to answer the question, it might be worthwhile just maybe defining how I interpret ESG. I think there's many different definitions of ESG. There's many different interpretations of what it is. I like to use the traditional definition of ESG. And to explain that, we can go right back to where it started. ESG is not a new term. It's definitely exploded in the past 2 to 3 years, but it's been around for at least 15 years, the concept of ESG. And it started within the investor community who wanted to basically understand what risks they were facing, non-financial risks from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. So it was very much about managing risks facing an investment or an asset that they were investing in or developing in. If you fast forward till today, some people define ESG as an opportunity to showcase all the great things that they're doing across the portfolio. Some think of ESG as purely sustainability and about carbon and energy, and others think of sustainability in terms of risk management and how they can better manage risks from non-financial indicators. And I think that's where it's become quite blurry in terms of the definition of ESG. I'm fortunate that many investors that I speak to and property companies still look at it from a risk perspective. What are the risks that I'm facing from an environmental, social, and governance perspective? Now, those risks are going to differ not just across countries, not just within a country, but across every organization. They all face different risks. I think to your question, the intersection between wellness and ESG, wellness is obviously one component of the social pillar, but there's many other social metrics that can help with, and some not necessarily, but it's a very important pillar within the social component of ESG. If we think of the biggest cost to any company, it's not its rent or its energy or its electricity, it's people and salaries. That is the biggest cost to a company, that human capital management. And so if you're thinking of ESG, like I defined from a risk perspective, the biggest risk that a company faces is its workforce and its people, because it's its biggest cost, one of the biggest risks. And so I think we really need to appreciate that in terms of the intersection between wellness and ESG, it falls within that social component, but it's a really, really important component of that social pillar of sustainability, which is a fairly new pillar. We've been measuring environmental metrics for a very long time. Carbon and energy efficiency and waste. We've been measuring those for 20 years, whereas some of the social and wellness components, they're fairly new. And so we're still trying to figure out how to measure those and actually report on those.
I think that's a great point that you made, that it's always been there. It's about how you look at the matrices in the current context. So can you elaborate on specific initiatives or global practices within the corporate sector specifically that successfully integrate wellness programs with a strong commitment to ESG principles?
Sure. I think one thing that we're seeing a trend, not globally, but specifically across Asia Pacific, is around offshore investments and money coming from outside of a country's borders. We've seen that in India. There's been a huge amount of investment from around the world. It's one of the most exciting investment opportunities globally. Thailand's another example that's seen a lot of offshore investment. From an ESG perspective, many of these investors really want to have assurance with those investments, and they look for something that they can trust in. And oftentimes, if we're talking about property, that's the likes of rating tools that are universal and global, like LEED. LEED, you could argue, is the world's currency when it comes to rating tools. It's understood across every market. But Well's also well placed for that because of the fact that it is universal. It's not specific to one country and it can be applied. I think we've got over 100 different countries that are using Well. So that's one global practice that we're starting to see. When there's money coming from outside the country in, they often like to find ways that they can assure that those investments are meeting a certain standard, and investors often use rating tools. One other thing I'll mention is we're seeing a big trend and a best practice when it comes to ESG, that it's not just about looking at one project or a handful of projects. It's about looking at a portfolio. If we're talking about property, 10 years ago, people were really celebrating the performance of one single asset. But from an ESG perspective, an investor wants to know, how is your portfolio performing? And looking at a company holistically, not just looking at one single asset. So this idea of equity has become really big. I would say it's a specific initiative that organizations are looking at. They're not just trying to focus on high performing buildings, but they're trying to get the baseline, all their buildings, to be higher performing. And I think that's something that's definitely a new trend. When I speak to investors, I spoke to one about 3 weeks ago, a big Australian investor, and they were saying that, if they look at a company they're investing in, do they want to invest in one building that's got a really high performance, say 95 points on any given rating tool, or would they rather invest in a portfolio that has a lower score per building but has a higher amount of impact across a workforce? So, for example, if you think of it from an impact perspective, one building getting 100 points that has 100 occupants, or 100 buildings that have 100 occupants that have 5 points, your impact is bigger when you're looking at things at scale. And I think, to the question on the commitment to ESG principles, there's a big commitment to look at things comprehensively and holistically, and not just look at them in isolation from the broader portfolio.
And when we look at things at scale, I think India being one of the most populous countries. So let me shift the focus to India. In what ways can companies in India navigate the challenges of promoting employee well-being while also aligning to the ESG goals, particularly in sectors which traditionally are less sustainable? Well, as a country, we've always been sustainable, but in the current context, and then still keeping the tradition alive, how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I couldn't agree more with you about the scale of India and the impact that we can actually have on people across the country. When I work with some of the accounts that I work with across Asia Pacific, they all have offices in India. And when those buildings go for certification, they're impacting tens of thousands of people, which is very rewarding because they have multiple campuses with so many people within those buildings. So I think my hope would be that the Indian market does look at these ESG at scale and not just at an individual perspective. I think there really doesn't need to be any form of trade-off between wellness and ESG. And I think sometimes people think there is a trade-off. They actually work really well together, and wellness is just one component of ESG. I need to be honest, I'm not familiar with the major challenges that India faces. I've never lived in the country. I've worked with the Indian market, but I don't appreciate the nuances, that the challenges that the country faces. I think one opportunity that there is that India can possibly leapfrog many of the mistakes that other countries have had. Because of the rapid growth that India is experiencing now, there is opportunities to bypass many of those mistakes. I've heard of a really good example. I come from South Africa, and there's many countries in Africa which are also experiencing rapid growth, and they're having a lot of infrastructure developed in that country. And a good example is telephone wires. If you think of a developed country, there's telephone wires on every single street. At least I speak from Australia. But countries in Africa that don't have telephone, they can skip that and go straight to, cellular networks, and they have the opportunity to overcome and bypass that bulky infrastructure. And I think India has an opportunity like that. There's many countries that have a specific culture in terms of their work culture. And I think because of the rapid growth that it is experiencing, there's a potential to form new ways of working in new cultures. So yeah, I'm still working in the Indian market. I'm still learning about some of the challenges that are faced. One thing that I do find that, and we can maybe touch on this later on, is one of the biggest challenges from a health and wellness perspective is air pollution. I don't think that's would come as a surprise to many, and I think that's a huge opportunity, which I'd love to chat about later on.
Absolutely. I think so. Just to highlight that in India, SEBI, which is the board wherein the first 100 listed companies need to report on ESG frameworks, and it's of course the news is tightening there. So as the ESG framework gains prominence globally and in India, how can IWBI's presence in India contribute to sustainable practices, and what role can it play in supporting environmental and social goals?
Yeah, cool. Well, I guess first off, I might just provide some context for IWBI's presence in India. India is the third largest market for well globally, and it's not official, but I would say it's the fastest growing market for well globally. We've seen a significant uptake in terms of certifications and well at scale in India, particularly in the last 12 months. As we speak, there's over 1,000 individual buildings in India that are registered for full certification. It's around about 35 million square feet. The biggest sector is the banking sector. So that's been one that's really taken up this health and well-being. And oftentimes it is multinational organizations. About 30% of the projects are from the banking sector, followed by property companies at 25%. So those are the two big sectors. And technology is actually also growing. So we've got some really big global technology firms. We do, as of this week, have someone based in India, which is a big milestone for us as an organization to have someone on the ground. We fully appreciate that. The India market's very much about forming strong face-to-face relationships, which is why the likes of myself and others spend a lot of time in India. But it was really important for someone to be based in India that understands, as you mentioned earlier, the different nuances between different cities and how business works, and someone that actually appreciates that more than, say, an outsider would. So we do have presence on the ground in India, which is exciting. I think to your question, what role can IWBI play? The first is, as I mentioned earlier, trying to measure social performance and social metrics has been challenging for a long time. There's a myth that we can't measure social performance around ESG, which is actually untrue. There's lots of ways, and none of them are a perfect science, but we do have ways to measure and track performance over time and actually benchmark how an organization or how a portfolio is performing. So I think that's the first thing, helping put a structure and a framework around the social metrics and ensuring that we can start to measure and show progress towards that. So I think from a benchmarking perspective, that's going to be really important. The second is that we can compare apples with apples globally. So if you take a building that's in India versus a building that's in Australia, China, the UK, America, it's all using the same tool. And so you can actually compare the performance of one building versus an outside building, which is really exciting. And to be honest with you, the Indian buildings that get certification are often in the 90 points plus. So we don't just say they're high performing, they've confirmed and validated that they're very high performing buildings. So I think from a motivation and inspiration perspective, it's really powerful that there are buildings in India that are better than buildings everywhere else around the world, and they can be a bit of a beacon of hope. So I think that's the second role. The third, I would say, is around the independent validation piece. So as we know, ESG scrutiny is growing, and there's a lot more requirements around how your claims that you're making, especially when you're reporting publicly. Those top 100 companies that are being required to report, they need to back up those claims. And I think IWBI and the products that are on offer, whether that's well certification or the health safety rating or the well equity rating, they provide that independent validation, which I think is really important from an ESG reporting perspective. So I would say that the other one I would mention is rating tools like IWBI or the US Green Building Council. It's our responsibility to ensure that we're on top of the latest trends and the latest issues that face organizations from at least our perspective, a health and wellness perspective. And I think being in India, having a presence in India, we can often help the India market about what are those important trends that are coming, that we're seeing, how can they respond to those, what are some of the solutions that we're seeing in other parts of the world, and how can we make sure that it's adding value to businesses. So I think that's probably one, almost like a help the India market stay adaptable and respond to those trends. I would say those are probably the top 4 ways we could help the India market.
Absolutely. I would just like to highlight that I've been part of certifying 3 platinum projects in India, and I can certainly vouch
awesome.
for crossing the 90 milestone. So I
and
do.
It's not easy, is it? When
yes.
you've got
Yes.
it's a
Yes.
huge milestone, and in a country like India where many of the practices aren't, and this is not just India, it's across Asia Pacific, many of the practices that contribute to WELL certification aren't as advanced as they are in other regions. So you have to work a little bit harder in many aspects to get to that point of something being compliant. So when a project in India, and I had 2 that I was working with last year, get 96 points, I think it was, it's an incredible achievement given where the India market is compared to other parts of the world. So well done if you've worked on those type of projects.
Thank you. I was very lucky for that. So that's, I think, a perfect segue for us to move into the technology part of things. So what role do you think technology and innovation plays in advancing wellness programs within the ESG framework? And how can businesses in India leverage these tools to enhance both employee well-being and sustainable practices? I think one of the things you also touched upon was air quality. And I have seen in my work around the platinum projects that I'm talking about, air quality is one of the most critical factors. And I have seen personally, if you achieve success around that, which we have in the projects that I was mentioning, it's a great achievement for us, because then you are providing a quality which is very different from what is there outside. So I just want to hear your views around that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. When we started, 10 years ago, we had to do actual on-site, for the most part, we had to do on-site tests to validate how that building's performing. We still do it today with a performance testing organization. They'll come on site and they'll do handheld tests and send samples to the laboratory. From a technology perspective, we've seen a big shift around sensors in buildings, and sensors actually capturing data in real time. Now, some would argue those sensors aren't as accurate as the handheld when it's sent to the laboratory, but they serve a purpose, and that purpose is to understand how that building is performing in real time. And what's exciting in how technology can support wellness is that buildings can then respond to those results in real time. I'll give you an example. In Australia in December 2019, we had the horrific bushfires that ravaged most of the east coast of Australia, and the air quality was horrible for weeks and weeks and weeks. The buildings that were well designed from a health and well-being perspective, that could track the performance, they could manage those buildings and allow people in and out a lot better than the buildings that didn't. So the buildings that had air sensors, that increased air, had higher air filtration, purification, those buildings were better resilient. They were more able to adapt to the external situation. So I think from that perspective, technology's come quite a long way, just having sensors in buildings. I do think that will always be a need for handheld testing for certain parameters and sending samples to the laboratory because of the level of accuracy with that, but I think they work well together. Another one is around surveys and really understanding. The Leesman survey is a good example, really understanding how people interact with an environment, how their perceptions towards that office space and their environment. I don't know how the uptake of the Leesman survey in India, but it's very widely adopted in other parts of the world, and it gives organizations a really clear understanding how they can respond to user preferences. So I think that's another kind of technological way. To your question on air quality, I think it's one of the most important metrics that the Indian community needs to track. I think we all know that there is high levels of outdoor pollution, air pollution in India and other parts of Asia. That doesn't mean that should be indoor pollution as well. We've got the technology to be able to keep that outside and keep the inside of the air of high quality. And traveling to India last year, I traveled to really good buildings that had the highest levels of air filtration, air purification, and old buildings, and you can very quickly tell which are the great buildings and which are the ones that are less good from an air quality perspective. So I think technology has a big role to play in that in terms of air pollution. And in parts of China, we've heard that many organizations pursue WELL certification because of the importance that it places on air quality across all of the different features that look at air, not just air quality, but things around formaldehyde, smoking, all of that. And people that live and work in WELL certified spaces, they often feel like the air is better inside than it is outside. And that's because it is, because these organizations have prioritized that.
Absolutely, I think very important. So in that regards, in your opinion, what are the key matrices or indicators that the organizations in India should focus on to measure the success and impact of the integrated wellness and ESG initiatives, especially on the policy side of things?
Yeah, I think so I've mentioned air quality, and I think that's one that every Indian organization should be prioritizing. Given the technology exists, it's a fairly low-hanging fruit. I think to start off with, I wouldn't say there's one, besides air quality, there's not necessarily one issue or metric that every organization should look at. I think it's important that organizations do go through a materiality assessment. So really understanding what are the material issues that we face. And there's many great consultants in the market that can help organizations do that. And I'm sure, Shuchita, you do that yourself, help organizations with understanding what those key risks are. From a policy perspective, one of my observations, having worked with the Indian market, is around work hours. And I'm told that work hours can typically be long and difficult work hours, and they can be a blend between work and home life. This is from what I've been told. I think we've seen some really good policies coming out of Australia and other parts of the world where there is appreciation that work and home should be separated. It has a huge impact on mental health, and I think that's another area that from what I'm told, the Indian market can look to work on policies around mental health. The other one is around parental leave and giving people time to spend with their new families, whether that's the mother or the father. Asia as a region is quite far behind that as opposed to other parts of the world. For example, in Australia, women get 22 weeks government pay as maternity leave. Organizations often match that. Fathers, as for parental leave, often get about half of that. So it's still very progressive, but I think from the Indian perspective, from what I'm told, there's a bit of work that can be done around that space as well. But again, to my point, the materiality assessment is so important to every organization, because you'll work through all of the issues from a social perspective, environmental perspective, and governance perspective, and you'll basically do a risk likely consequence, and you can prioritize those and understand which are the biggest risks that we're facing and how do we tackle that. And if I go back to my previous comment about surveys, you can combine that with the survey responses of the people that form part of your workforce, and you can kind of come up with some really good responses to that.
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been part of one of the surveys from a previous organization, which was adapting well across the portfolio. And we did conduct surveys pre and post occupancy. And it's very heartening to see the kind of improvement that comes, the areas that we need improvement on, and how the improvement happens. It's a very big boost for, I think, everybody who's worked around it and who's actually been a part of it.
And it also shows the value of going through the process, which I think is really important, because at the end of the day, people are the most valuable asset to any organization. And if you can actually show that they're happier post an initiative or program or certification as opposed to pre, that's a really good outcome, and it's a good story that I think people need to share.
So as we are in the last few minutes of the session, I just want to touch upon, so basically, as you know, the webinar reaches audiences from government bodies as well. So do you think government and regulatory bodies in India can incentivize organizations to adopt comprehensive well-being programs while also ensuring the adherence to ESG, which is, as I mentioned, tightening the nose on? So I just want to highlight one trivia before we answer this. So basically the MSME sector, the micro, small and medium enterprises sector in India, which is called the backbone of the country, and it contributes to almost 30% of the GDP. So given the diverse socio-economic landscape in India, how can wellness and ESG initiatives be tailored to address the unique challenges faced by different demographic groups within the country? And not only demographic groups, I believe as we navigate through the evolving landscape of wellness and ESG, how can businesses in India in general stay adaptable and responsive to the emerging trends while maintaining a strong commitment to well-being of their employees and sustainable practices. So wanting to hear from both the sides of the story.
Yeah, cool. I think from a government perspective, the government can obviously incentivize businesses to prioritize wellness. They can do a carrot or a stick, whichever approach they think is necessary. But governments themselves have a big role to play from a public perspective. And I do a lot of travel to Singapore. And Singapore government has a huge focus on the health and well-being of their citizens. They appreciate that they've got an aging population, and they want to make sure that their citizens feel as if they are healthy. So things like, greening the cities, that's something that the government does itself. You go to Singapore, it's an urban jungle, and that's a direct result of the government taking action and the government incentivizing. I think the other important point to note is that in the government, one of the government's role is to attract investment from outside India towards India, and to give investors confidence that the Indian economy is strong and that it's an attractive place to invest in. And this outside investment, they want to have a certain level of expectation that the workforce that they're investing in is well looked after, well protected, because they're part of their supply chain. So if a company in Australia is owning a company or investing in a company in India, they need to report on what they're doing to look after the people in India. So I think the government can really share that message that organizations need to look after their own people and take initiatives, because it's going to help the overall economy attract that capital from outside. So that's what I would say. I don't think I could speak to the different demographic groups in India, just not being familiar with the market. So I might skip over that one. But to your question about how businesses in India can stay adaptable and responsive to emerging trends, I think you mentioned the word adaptable is probably the right word. Organizations do need to appreciate that the ESG landscape is very much a moving target. It changes frequently year on year. The issues that emerge are often different. The reporting and regulation is very different. The frameworks change. So there's a lot of change in the space. So organizations just need to build a culture of adaptability to be able to respond to those. Businesses also need to make health and well-being and wellness part of the culture and the DNA of their businesses. It's not a one-time initiative or policy or program that you do and then you forget about. We often use the analogy that, you don't go to gym once and say that you're fit and healthy. You've got to go to gym consistently. You've got to go, and over time, your fitness levels and your health will improve. But it's not you go to gym once. You've got no reason to say that you're very healthy and fit, and you never go again. And it's a journey, and I think organizations need to appreciate that. They need to stay adaptable. They need to be able to pivot as the issues change. Something like a materiality assessment that I mentioned earlier, you don't do that once and then do it again in 20 years. It's something that you do once, and every year you do it, you update that, you re-explore, you reevaluate where you're at. And that's what we really like about the WELL standard, is that it's a cyclical process. You benchmark your performance, you get your certification in year one, and come year three, you have to recertify, and you have to constantly make sure that your building is performing to that high level, which I think is incredibly important. And then the last thing I'll mention is, when you say how can businesses stay adaptable, just working with the likes of IWBI and the likes of the US GBC and other rating tools, because as I mentioned, it's our responsibility to make sure that those ESG trends and issues are being captured within our own frameworks. So WELL is updated on a quarterly basis. Whenever there's an important trend or issue that emerges, we build that into the tool so that the industry can use it while applying WELL. And so I think just being part of our movement and joining our types of webinars and just being familiar with the WELL standard is a good way to know what are the big key issues that globally we're facing from a WELL health and wellness perspective. So I'll end on that.
No, thanks a lot, Devan. I think it's the last 30 minutes have just made me richer with a lot of information and insights that you provided. Thank you so much. And as you mentioned, I'd just like to end on the note that well-being is a journey, and I think we just need to find out the right tools. And I'll really give it to IWBI, having worked on a lot of projects, of the kind of amazing frameworks and tools they've created for our help in our journey towards that well-being. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll just end that the tools are only as good as the industry that adopts them and takes them on. And The fact that the Indian market is the fastest growing market for well globally, the fact that we've got over 1,000 projects now, over 35 million square feet, that's testament to the Indian community and the Indian industry, and not necessarily us. We can't take credit for that. That's the Indian community appreciating that health and wellness is an important issue and they need to address it and they do something about it. And it's just been so inspiring to work with Indian companies that are doing this at scale. You look at many bigger property companies, they're not getting one certification a year, they're getting 20 a year, which is so unique to the Indian market. We don't see that anywhere else in the world. And so I do see the Indian market as really leading this in many ways. So a big thank you to you and Buzz on Earth and others who are kind of spearheading this, the focus on wellness. It's really impressive to see from the outside of India looking in, and then obviously traveling to India and experiencing it there too. It's very rewarding.
Thank you so much, Devan. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.